The smell of a morning coffee, the memory of last Christmas, and the pain of touching a hot surface. That's your nervous system at work. The nervous system allows each body system to communicate with each other and monitors internal and external changes to build a proper response that keeps us alive and kicking. Now, to make things a bit easier, the nervous system is structurally subdivided into two anatomical components, called the central nervous system, or CNS for short, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which consists of the remainder of the nervous system outside of the CNS. Both the CNS and the PNS are made up of the functional units of the nervous system, called neurons, or nerve cells. These cells have many parts, with the main part being the cell body, which houses the nucleus of the cell. From the cell body arise two types of extensions: dendrites, which are short projections and may be numerous, and an axon, or nerve fiber, which is a single long extension that looks like a thread. Now, neurons are special because they're able to receive and send electrical impulses that allow for communication with other neurons, as well as with effector cells, like muscle cells. This process starts at the dendrites, which receive electrical signals from other neurons and convey it towards the cell body. Then, the cell body produces an electrical impulse and sends it through its own single axon. Many axons are covered with a layer of lipids and proteins that speed up the conduction of these impulses, called the myelin sheath. Now, the electrical impulse eventually reaches the distal parts of an axon, called the axon terminals. Here, an axon terminal can meet up with a dendrite of another neuron, and this contact site is called a synapse, which facilitates the communication between neurons. Now, there are a few types of neurons that are structurally different from one another. Neurons that have two or more dendrites and a single axon, like the one we just described, are called multipolar neurons. They're the most common type of neurons in the entire nervous system. For example, almost all motor neurons that control voluntary muscles in the body are multipolar neurons. Other types of neurons include bipolar and pseudo-unipolar neurons. Bipolar neurons are neurons with a cell body that has a single dendrite on one side and a single axon on the other side. These cells often act as sensory neurons, meaning that they relay sensory input to the central nervous system. An example would be the bipolar cells at the roof of the nasal cavity, which aid in the transmission of special sensory information, or our sense of smell, to the brain. Lastly are pseudo-unipolar neurons, which have a short, seemingly single, but actually double process that extends from the cell body. This common process divides into a peripheral process that extends from a sensory receptor to the cell body, and a central process that continues from the cell body towards the CNS. So an electrical impulse that is generated at a receptor, like touch or pain receptors in the skin, travels through the peripheral process and then continues into the CNS through its central process. All right, let's take a quick break to see if we can identify the different types of neurons. Great! Now, neurons are a bit like humans. They always need someone for support. And that's where neuroglia come in. Neuroglia, or glial cells, are the only other cell type found in the nervous system. And although there are several different types of neuroglia, they all function in some way to support and nourish neurons. These cells are smaller than neurons. But fun fact, there are 5 times as many glial cells as there are neurons in the body. All right, now let's switch gears and discuss the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. The main role of the CNS is to coordinate and integrate neuronal signals from the periphery, as well as perform higher-order functions like learning. Now, there is important terminology used when discussing different parts of the CNS. Let's start with talking about gray and white matter. Let's look at a coronal section of the brain. Note that the brain tissue has two different colored areas. Gray matter forms the outer portion of the brain and is the place where neuron cell bodies are found. This outer portion of the brain is often referred to as the cerebral cortex. The white matter, on the other hand, forms the inner portion of the brain and mainly consists of axons transmitting signals from one area to another. Remember that axons are typically covered with a myelin sheath that is made up of lipids. So this is what gives white matter its lighter appearance. Now, the spinal cord also has gray and white matter, but from a transverse section, we can see that their organization is the other way around. The gray matter lies in the center, and the white matter is found in the periphery. The gray matter of the spinal cord is shaped like a butterfly and has two major parts, an anterior part called the anterior horn, and a posterior part called the posterior horn. Also, a group of neuronal cell bodies may sometimes occupy a region surrounded by white matter, deep in the brain and brainstem. In this case, a group of neuron cell bodies in the CNS is called a nucleus. For example, in the brain surrounded by white matter are several distinct groups of cell bodies, called basal nuclei. Now, a bundle of axons within the CNS is called a tract, like the corticospinal tract, which consists of the axons of motor neurons extending from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. Now, the other division of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, which carries messages to and from the central nervous system and consists of neuron cell bodies and axons, or nerve fibers, outside of the CNS. The components of the PNS are similar to the CNS, but the terminology used is slightly different. In the PNS, a group of cell bodies is called a ganglion. For example, the cell bodies of peripheral sensory neurons are located outside the spinal cord in the dorsal root ganglion. And a bundle of axons running together in the PNS is called a nerve. Now, there are two types of nerves in the peripheral nervous system: nerves that arise from the spinal cord, called spinal nerves, and nerves that arise from the brain, called cranial nerves. Let's start first with cranial nerves, which are 12 pairs of nerves that exit the skull through different openings, or foramina. The cranial nerves then travel to mainly innervate structures of the head and neck. These nerves can be divided into 3 groups, depending on the type of information that they carry, as either sensory, motor, or mixed cranial nerves. Now remember, although the cranial nerves originate from the brain, which is part of the CNS, they are still considered to be part of the peripheral nervous system. The other type of nerves in the PNS are spinal nerves, which are nerves that arise directly from the spinal cord via 2 roots, called the ventral or anterior roots and dorsal or posterior roots. Now, the ventral or anterior roots consist of a number of efferent or motor fibers from the anterior horn of gray matter within the spinal cord. These fibers carry motor information from the CNS to the muscles of the body. The dorsal or posterior roots, on the other hand, consist of afferent or sensory fibers, which carry sensory information from the periphery to the posterior horn of gray matter in the spinal cord. You can remember these terms by the simple mnemonic: afferent fibers arrive and efferent fibers exit the spinal cord. Now, the ventral and dorsal nerve roots combine to form a mixed spinal nerve, which has both motor and sensory fibers. There are 31 spinal cord segments, with 31 pairs of spinal nerves arising from them. Starting superiorly, there are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic, 5 pairs in the lumbar region, another 5 pairs in the sacral region, and a single pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. The spinal cord segments and spinal nerves are identified by a letter and a number, indicating their region and level. For example, the 5th spinal nerve in the thoracic region will be abbreviated as the T5 spinal nerve. Now, each mixed spinal nerve almost immediately divides into 2 rami, a large anterior ramus and a small posterior ramus, that supply different parts of the body. Because both the anterior and posterior rami are branches of mixed spinal nerves, they carry both sensory and motor fibers. These rami, particularly the anterior rami, tend to join and rebranch in complex ways as they continue distally from the spinal cord, forming other nerves and networks of intersecting nerves called plexuses. For example, the anterior rami of spinal nerves C5 through T1 join to form a number of nerves that make up the brachial plexus, which gives branches that supply the muscles and skin of the upper limbs. All right, before we hit our last topic, pause the video and check which nerve structures you can recall. Great! Now, each spinal nerve innervates a particular area of the body. The specific muscles that each spinal nerve supplies with motor innervation is called a myotome. Each spinal nerve also receives sensory information from a specific area of the skin, which is called a dermatome. You can easily remember these terms since derma in Greek means skin, and myo refers to muscles. Now, each dermatome and myotome is labeled with a letter and number that corresponds to its associated spinal nerve. For example, the skin around the umbilicus or belly button is innervated by the T10 spinal nerve, so we call this area the T10 dermatome. We often use these colorful dermatome maps to help visualize the specific regions that are supplied by each pair of spinal nerves. All right, as a quick recap, the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system, consisting of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which comprises the rest of the nervous tissues. The nervous tissue has 2 types of cells: neurons that transmit signals and supporting glial cells. In the central nervous system, groups of neuron cell bodies form nuclei that comprise the gray matter, while myelinated axons form tracts and comprise the white matter of the CNS. In the peripheral nervous system, a group of cell bodies is called a ganglion, and bundles of axons are called nerves. The PNS consists of 12 pairs of cranial nerves that arise from the brain, and 31 pairs of spinal nerves that arise directly from the spinal cord, with each nerve being formed by the union of ventral and dorsal roots. Efferent fibers leave the spinal cord from the anterior horn through the ventral root and provide motor innervation to muscles, while afferent fibers enter the posterior horn of the spinal cord through the dorsal root and provide sensory signals to the central nervous system. The short spinal nerves then branch into anterior and posterior rami. Dermatomes and myotomes are segments of the skin and underlying muscles that correspond to the areas innervated by each spinal nerve.
Whether you're playing volleyball with friends or just watching TV, your nervous system is always operating, making sure that the right organs function at the right time. The nervous system is structurally divided into 2 regions, called the central nervous system, or CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The peripheral nervous system can be further subdivided functionally into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Okay, let's start with the somatic nervous system, which describes a set of nerve fibers that control voluntary actions and convey sensory information from the skin, skeletal muscles, and joints. Somatic sensory fibers allow transmission of sensory information such as touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception. For example, somatic sensory fibers inform our CNS that our cup of coffee is too hot. Then there are somatic motor fibers, which only innervate skeletal muscle and control voluntary actions of the body, like putting the coffee cup back on the table until it cools down. On the flip side, the autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary activities within the body. This system consists of visceral motor fibers that carry motor signals to smooth muscle, such as that found in the intestinal walls that allow for peristalsis to occur, as well as cardiac muscle and glandular tissue. We also have visceral sensory fibers, which are not typically defined as part of the autonomic nervous system, but they act in conjunction with the visceral motor fibers of the autonomic nervous system to control visceral function. Visceral sensory fibers travel with the visceral motor fibers, carrying sensory information from the viscera back to the CNS, where the visceral motor fibers will act in response to this sensory information. For example, they provide information about things such as the amount of oxygen in your blood, your arterial blood pressure, and the level of distension of your stomach after that big meal. This visceral sensory information is continuously regulating the activity of the visceral motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system, even while you sit here and watch this osmosis video. Now, there is also a unique set of sensory neurons we want to mention called special sensory fibers, which relay sensory information related to our special senses, such as smell, sight, taste, hearing, and balance, back to the CNS for interpretation. These fibers are not really classified as part of the somatic or autonomic nervous system. However, this information can modulate the activity of the somatic motor system, such as sending signals to skeletal muscles to turn your head in response to a sound. Or the autonomic nervous system, such as stimulating salivary glands in response to the smell of a freshly baked apple pie. Okay, now let's dive a bit more into the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. The ANS has two major subdivisions, the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system, or PSNS. In addition, some classify the enteric nervous system, which is the intrinsic nervous system of the GI tract, as the third subdivision of the ANS. Now, let's start by discussing the SNS and PSNS, which, for the most part, have opposite effects in the body. Alright, now you've probably heard about the fight or flight response, which kicks in when one encounters an alarming situation, like seeing a bear on your hike, or before taking an exam. These situations activate the SNS, which prepares the body to respond to extreme or stressful situations. For example, the sympathetic nervous system will cause dilation of the pupils to improve vision, increased heart rate and blood pressure, and diversion of blood flow to the organs that will help with our fight or flight response, like skeletal muscles and the brain. On the flip side, organs that are not urgently needed to address the immediate stressful situation, like the kidneys and the gastrointestinal tract, are toned down. Okay, so once that bear is gone, or the exam is over, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in to calm things down. It does so by decreasing your heart rate and blood pressure, increasing gut motility and digestive secretions, and by allowing blood to flow back to the organ systems that have been put on hold by the sympathetic nervous system, like the digestive system. These effects can be summarized as the body's rest and digest response. In a nutshell, you can think of these two divisions of the ANS like a seesaw, where they work together to balance each other out. Alright, as a quick break, let's see if you can answer the following questions. What are the main divisions of the peripheral nervous system? How about the different components of the autonomic nervous system? Okay, now let's discuss how information from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems communicate through the central nervous system. Remember that a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called a nucleus, while a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion. Now, information that's conveyed in the autonomic nervous system passes from the CNS to its target organ through a two-neuron system. The first neuron sending a signal from the central nervous system is called a preganglionic or presynaptic neuron, and the second neuron that the preganglionic neuron synapses with is called a postganglionic or postsynaptic neuron. This second neuron is usually the effector neuron, meaning that it then directly synapses on the organ that it acts on. Now, there are other differences between the sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions of the ANS, based on the locations of the preganglionic neuron cell bodies and the route that the pre- and postganglionic neurons take to reach their effector organs. Let's start by talking about the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. So, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division are located in the intermediolateral nuclei, which make up the lateral horns of the spinal cord's gray matter in the thoracolumbar spinal cord segments. Specifically, the preganglionic neurons arise from the T1 to L3 spinal cord segments. Now, let's follow the path of the preganglionic neurons more closely. So, from the intermediolateral nucleus, all of the preganglionic sympathetic fibers exit the spinal cord via the anterior root and enter the anterior rami of spinal nerves T1 to L3. Shortly after, these fibers leave the anterior rami to enter the sympathetic chain via the white rami communicantes. The sympathetic chain, or trunk, is a paired structure that runs parallel on either side of the spinal cord, and it resembles an interconnected string of pearls. The sympathetic chain consists of a bundle of nerve fibers and neuron cell bodies. The neuron cell bodies within the sympathetic chain form the paravertebral ganglia. Now, when the preganglionic fibers enter the sympathetic chain, there are 4 possible routes for these fibers to take to synapse with their postganglionic counterparts. First, a preganglionic fiber can enter and immediately synapse with the postganglionic cell body in the paravertebral ganglion at its respective vertebral level. Second, it can also pass through the paravertebral ganglion to ascend, or third, to descend the sympathetic chain before synapsing at a paravertebral ganglia at another vertebral level. Fourth, and finally, the preganglionic fibers can pass through the paravertebral ganglia without synapsing, and instead, they continue via splanchnic nerves to one of a number of prevertebral ganglia located anterior to the aorta and synapse there. These ganglia are named according to the main aortic branch that they're positioned near. The most superior are the paired celiac ganglia, found around the celiac trunk. Just below are one or more superior mesenteric ganglia, followed by the inferior mesenteric ganglion. For preganglionic fibers that synapse in one of the paravertebral ganglia, their respective postganglionic fibers then enter the gray rami communicantes and re-enter and travel along spinal nerves towards their target organs. If they just pass through the sympathetic chain without synapsing, they continue to the prevertebral ganglia, where they synapse on postganglionic fibers that innervate their target organs. Now, since the majority of the preganglionic fibers of the SNS synapse within the sympathetic chain, they're relatively short, while the postganglionic fibers are longer, traveling all of the way from the sympathetic chain to target organs all over the body. Alright, now let's move on to the parasympathetic nervous system. This division is known as the craniosacral division, since the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons can be found in the gray matter of the brainstem and the sacral region of the spinal cord. The fibers arising from the brainstem leave the CNS through cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and they innervate the head, as well as the organs found in the thorax and abdomen. The fibers arising from the sacral region of the spinal cord exit through spinal nerves S2 to S4 to innervate the pelvic viscera, and some abdominal structures as well. Now, in contrast to the sympathetic division, the parasympathetic preganglionic fibers are very long, because they typically synapse in ganglia that are much closer to the target organs, and this means the postganglionic fibers are quite short. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the enteric nervous system is sometimes considered a third subdivision of the autonomic nervous system. The enteric nervous system is a semi-autonomous system of neurons that make up the majority of 2 nerve plexuses within the wall of the GI tract. The submucosal, or Meissner's plexus, which is located within the submucosa, and the myenteric, or Auerbach's plexus, which is found between the circular and longitudinal layers of the muscularis externa. Given these locations, it makes sense that the submucosal plexus is involved with regulating local secretion and absorption of the nearby mucosa. On the other hand, the myenteric plexus, being located within the muscularis externa, is more involved in regulating the tone of the gut wall and the intensity of contractions. Now, the enteric nervous system is nicknamed the gut brain because these nerve plexuses can actually act completely on their own, as they possess receptors, sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons, allowing for intrinsic reflexes to regulate GI function without any input from the CNS. For example, if stretch receptors in the stomach are activated by distension caused by a big meal, neurons within the wall of the stomach will directly activate smooth muscle fibers to increase motility, which will help digest that delicious veggie burger. Even though the enteric nervous system can act independently, though, it is still heavily influenced by the CNS, with the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems modulating the activity of the enteric nervous system. In the parasympathetic rest and digest response, the PSNS will interact with the enteric nervous system to mainly stimulate the activities of the digestive system, as opposed to the sympathetic fight or flight response, where the SNS will act to inhibit the activities of the digestive system. Okay, so before the recap, feel free to pause the video and see if you can identify the structures of the sympathetic nervous system. Alright, as a quick recap, the peripheral nervous system is functionally divided into the somatic nervous system, which consists of somatic sensory fibers as well as somatic motor fibers that control voluntary actions, and the autonomic nervous system, which is composed of fibers controlling involuntary functions of our body. The autonomic nervous system consists of visceral motor fibers that innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, and are accompanied by visceral sensory fibers that help regulate the function of the viscera. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic division in charge of the fight or flight response and its balancing counterpart, the parasympathetic division in charge of the rest and digest response. The preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system leave the CNS from the thoracic and lumbar spinal segments and synapse relatively close to the spine in paravertebral or prevertebral ganglia, meaning that their postganglionic neurons are quite long, running until they reach their target organs. The preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, leave the CNS from the brainstem and sacral spinal segments and synapse far away, closer to their target organs, meaning they typically consist of a long preganglionic neuron and a short postganglionic neuron. Finally, the enteric nervous system can also be considered part of the autonomic nervous system. It consists of the submucosal and myenteric plexuses within the wall of the GI tract. It can act independently of the CNS, but is also modulated by input from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems.